Sure.
And see what we come up with. And if I feel that you're going off topic, maybe I'll just raise my hand and then we can go back in.
All right.
Else.
All right.
But
In 5, 4, 3.
one of the personalities that isn't around anymore, but it had a major contribution in radio, was Andrew Allen. And I wanted to know what your thoughts about Andrew Allen's contribution were to radio in Canada.
Oh, they were tremendous, largely because he started in the business intending to change the scene. He started working first for a commercial station in Toronto, CFRB, and then with incredibly bad timing he went over to Europe in 1938 to try and make a career for himself in broadcasting over there, because he saw it simply moving faster than was the case in Canada. The CBC dramatic department at the time was in charge of a man called Rupert Lucas, who really was incompetent. And he had no vision at all of what Canadian radio drama might become, or indeed of what radio drama might become. And I think Andrew saw that so long as he was there, nothing was very likely to be done. On the other hand, the CBC had a very bright and inventive director of feature productions, some of which were dramas, or what today we would call docudramas, Frank Willis, who was very able indeed. But he was also a fixture. And Andrew really saw no place for himself there, I think. So he set off for Europe to make his fortune. But 1938, 39, terrible timing. While he was over there, realizing that he wasn't going to do well there at all, he received an invitation from Ernest Bushnell, who was the head of programming, all programming for the English network, to come back and head up a drama department in Vancouver, which he hoped to build up into something very important. And Andrew came back in a famous incident on a ship that got sunk, the Athenia. His father was killed in the same sinking, and he and his then fiancée, the actress Judith Evelyn, came back to Canada, but by this time he was a very sober young man. He had before been rather flamboyant and all over the place, but that sort of experience would sober a person. And he came out to Vancouver and set to work with very high aims indeed, working with a group of wonderfully able young people, John Draney, Alicia Sinclair, Fletcher Markle, Arthur Hill, who's in Hollywood now, and a good many others, quite remarkable performers all, and built up here in Vancouver an extraordinary corps of both performers and technicians, because Andrew was a master of the technical aspects of dramatic broadcasting. And then, of course, he went to Toronto in 1941 to head up drama when Lucas retired, or was pushed out, soon afterwards died, in fact. And Andrew there, having these 2 or 3 years in Vancouver of experimenting and working with bright young people, brought a new life to the whole national scene in Toronto that raised radio drama in Canada to the highest level in the world. There was absolutely no doubt that in its heyday during the 40s, Canadian radio drama was considered the best in the world, better than anything that was going on in the States, where the commercial aim was still to do shock, to do what would appeal to people, not the difficult, complex things that Andrew was trying. His only rival in the field really was what was going on in British broadcasting, which had fallen into the hands of some pretty fancy intellectual experimenters. Andrew was doing stuff from the international repertoire, as well as adaptations from everywhere, great novels and so on, and new and vital Canadian works. And this brought back some of the Canadian writers who had been abroad, who had made their success in Britain or in the United States, like Gerald Knoxon. Some of them came back from Hollywood, like Reuben Shipp, who wrote The Investigator, which, as you'll remember, was the program with John Draney playing Senator McCarthy that was pirated in the States and became so popular it was a serious factor in the downfall of Senator McCarthy. That program, if nothing else, celebrated Canadian radio drama all over the world. But that was Andrew's remarkable achievement, which he was not able to duplicate, unfortunately, when television came along, so that the span of his real influence was the 40s.
Could you talk a bit about what it was like to be part of that when Andrew Allen would walk in to rehearsal and you were there with other actors, and what it was like? Can you sort of recreate any of that sense of what it was, the process that you went through?
Well, there was, first of all, an extraordinary professionalism that he insisted upon. During rehearsals, no matter how good the friends were off the set, during rehearsal it was Mr. Allen and Mr. Moore and Miss Mallet. And we called each other regularly in these formal terms. And he demanded the same kind of utter professionalism in whatever you did. This was live drama, so that there was no time for fluffing, very little time for rehearsal. They were complex shows which he was doing, usually done pretty much in one day, although the leads may have had the script in advance. We would convene at the studio on McGill Street in Toronto at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning and have, first of all, a read-through at sight, because most of the cast would not have seen it, until the lunch break. Then while the actors went to a nearby restaurant for lunch, where they did indeed relax, the musicians under Lucio Agostini came into the studio. His orchestra, which varied in size but was usually somewhere between 16 and 24 pieces, with specially commissioned and written music, they would rehearse. We would come back from lunch, and then we would, what was called woodshed, fitting the two together, three together, the sound effects, the music, and the action, and all in the same studio, so that the control was not the way it's done today, with a split feed, so that you can vary the levels. The levels had to be got right, all in the same studio, all at the same time, and everything had to be timed right. And then we would have a rough dress before we parted on Saturday. Then on Sunday evening, when the show was on, it was a Sunday night show, prime time, second only, incidentally, to Hockey Night in Canada in terms of its audience, much the most popular drama show there's ever been in Canada. And we would come in and do a dress rehearsal, and then have a short break, and then do the show live. And God help you if you made a mistake. Often this was very difficult, especially with serious shows where somebody would make a funny mistake, and the great temptation was to break up, and this was not allowed.
Well, you mentioned one in your book, particularly, I guess, comes to mind, was Barry Morse.
Yeah, Barry, we were doing East Lynne, a great old melodrama, and the original line of the character from this man who discovers when his wife has died, a locket which she had kept all these years, and he opens the locket and in this very touching moment says, a lock of my first wife's hair. And unfortunately Barry said, a lock of my wife's first hair. And the rest of us in the cast were, going. But we passed it off. I think the worst fluff of that kind I ever made was in a program dramatizing the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava, and I was playing Lord Raglan, the originator of the Raglan coat, who was in charge of the British troops. And finally, as they were ready to go, he'd given them full instructions how to do for the cavalry to ride down and attack the enemy. And his line was, "All right, men, now ride straight through their files." And I came out large as life on the show with, "All right, men, now ride straight through their flies." Files! I corrected myself. Too late. But in those days of live radio, there was always this terrible danger. And sometimes doing a comic show, it didn't matter. But this was even harder because doing comedy is very, very difficult, and especially when surrounded with all the technical paraphernalia, the mics, the sound effects, and so on. You must maintain your concentration like that in comedy, so it was often harder. But Andrew was a very serious taskmaster. The one thing he would not brook was laziness or incompetence. And he would direct an actor very charmingly, very sweetly, until a certain point. And if he wasn't getting what he wanted from them, the courtesy that he normally used turned to sheer ice. And he would say very bitter and cutting things to them, and they would not be used again. There grew up as a consequence the belief that there was a certain clique of actors who did the stage series, and to some extent this was true, but only because they were the ones who delivered, the ones he knew he could count on. But it was relatively easy for talented people to break in, so long as they fell in with this keen professionalism. But you must remember, too, this was a period, both in Vancouver and still to an extent in Toronto, when the theatre was amateur. Had not been before. The idea that the professional theatre in Canada was something new was ridiculous. For instance, in the 1920s, Toronto had 5 professional stock companies working all at the same time. And even some smaller Canadian towns had permanent acting companies. Saskatoon had a fine acting company, the young leading man of which, his name has now been forgotten because he went to Hollywood and changed it to Boris Karloff. But this professionalism was all across the country. It died in the 1930s with the 2 things, the crash of the stock market, of course, but even more important, in the very same year, 1929, the oncoming of the talking picture. And it was those 2 things together that really killed the theatre across the continent. And so it was not surprising that the main theatre in Canada was amateur. Well, amateurs are great, but the sense of firm, hard, tough discipline is something that it lacks by definition. And Andrew was the one who brought that firm, tough professionalism to the art of radio drama.
We might go back to radio, but that actually is a good lead-in because we come from, at that time, talking about going into professional theatre with your mother, with the Village Players and their decision to turn into a professional troupe under the new society.
Yes, yeah.
Talk about maybe a little bit about the challenge that your mother had faced in making that happen.
Well, there was a movement of which she had been a part for a long time to put the theatre on a more professional footing. But she had had her professional experience early. She was at RADA in London, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, the first Canadian to go there. And she had come back to North America and for some years played the leading roles for the most important of the touring Shakespearean companies, Sir Philip Van Greet's company, playing all over the continent. She'd played on Broadway and with stock companies in Chicago and other places. So, and this was a period before theatrical unions. They didn't come along till World War I. I'm talking of the period before then. And it was a very, very tough life indeed. And I can remember saying to her, you know, well, was it really rough for an actress? And she said, well, it was a very interesting thing. We actresses had no problem, because as soon as we joined a company, there would be one man who would appoint himself our guardians. And she said, we never had any trouble of the kind that there's supposed to be in the theater. She said if you looked for it, you could find it, but the girls who didn't want it were not bothered, because some senior professional performer would become a sort of official guardian and chaperone and see that they were well done by. And so this was remarkable training. She married and came back to Canada at the beginning of the First World War, gave up her career on the stage, did amateur work in Toronto during the 20s, repeated some of her roles that she'd played with Ben Greet, like Viola and Rosalind and As You Like It, and always was trying to work towards a professional company, but she realized it was going to have to come from the young people, because they were the only ones who were serious enough about it. The older amateurs who were maybe selling shirts at Eaton's or working in a bookstore somewhere, they were keenly interested and often very hard workers, but this was not their profession. Their job had to come first. Rehearsals were next door to impossible to arrange, and it was a big joke when something went wrong, you know, very, very different. And so she had been trying to move it along to a professional status by working with young people. And that was why she took this, fundamentally a group of high school students and university students, and finally the group decided that the time was ripe to go professional. She found a theater for them downtown, and thus it began.
That was that wasn't, they started in the barn, I guess that was called.
Yeah, we bought in 1938, we bought an old farmhouse, a log cabin farmhouse that was then on the outskirts of Toronto, long since been surrounded by high-rises and smashing mansions, and it had a barn. It wasn't easily accessible. And in the beginning we had neither plumbing nor electricity. We worked with candles in the barn for the lighting, and an outdoor john, you know. But a couple of years later we got both plumbing and electricity in. And it was in that barn on the outskirts of Toronto the Canadians caught their first glimpse of some of the European and American masters, Lorca, Brecht, Thornton Wilder, W.H. Auden. A lot of them were done in Canada for the first time in that barn. And also, that was where the tradition of doing new Canadian plays started. One-act plays to begin with, but at least we got the thing rolling. And then when the theatre moved down to the Royal Ontario Museum, the effort there was increasingly to mix the masterpieces of the past with new Canadian plays, until finally the New Play Society wound up doing whole seasons of Canadian plays. First time it had been done.
Someone who I wouldn't be interested in hearing your thoughts about, Lister Sinclair, described your mother, I guess it was in your book, as a gentle, genial steamroller?
Yes. Yes, Lister invented that phrase. It's a very descriptive one. Very good. She was very gentle with the people she was working with, and young people especially. But the steamroller came into effect when she found her way blocked by prejudice or stupidity. There's one story that I didn't tell in the book, which shows very much the toughness, again, of the professional attitude. We were touring Shakespeare with this company into the high schools. And I think it was Henry V that we were doing one night. The bus that had come from the high school to pick the company and its scenery up to take them to put on the play was an hour late. We were all waiting for about an hour. We got to the high school, of course, rushed into the theater, started setting up, costuming, making up, and so on, just as fast as we could go. And I was helping my mother resort the props on the stage when the principal, who decided that the audience was getting impatient and needed to be kept quiet, stepped before the front curtain and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we're so late. I thought I should come out and explain to you that the players weren't ready when the bus came to pick them up." And my mother had a cushion in her hand, and that cushion flew across the stage, almost bumped the principal, who's in front of the curtain, into the pit. But she not only did that, she stormed out through the center crack and said to this audience of parents and students, "Ladies and gentlemen, your principal is lying. We were not late for the bus. The bus was late for us," and went back in, leaving him with egg on his face. It was a dedication to the art, you see, that she was able to bring to it. And although she was tireless and sympathetic with young talent, as I say, she had no patience at all with people, perhaps especially men, because they were in the positions of authority, who were being stupid about it, about the value of the art.
Could you tell me a little bit about the contribution you think writers like Lister Sinclair, Harry Boyle, and Andrew Allan had to Canadian scene?
Well, it was very important at the time. Andrew, of course, was not primarily a writer. We did one of his plays, and I think it was a very much better play than it was given credit for being. But Harry Boyle had started not as a dramatist, but as a short story writer. He's writing stories about rustic life, rural life in Canada, farm life. He was the farm supervisor for the CBC. But he wrote a play for radio, which we then had him adapt for the stage. Lister Sinclair was a phenomenon. He had been a student of mathematics in Vancouver when Andrew found him, with one of these flypaper minds that picked up just about everything. He read an enormous amount by his mid-20s. He came to Toronto to do postgraduate work in mathematics at the University of Toronto, and that gradually gave way to his interest in radio. He has since become, of course, a very notable popularizer of all sorts of scientific subjects because of this double grasp he has of science and art. He was a very good actor also, but I think his mind was a little too active to stay in that role. He wanted to write what people said, not deliver what people said. And he was one of the catalysts because it was a sparkling, brilliant, very original mind that he had working. Another of them was Len Peterson, who had come from Saskatchewan. And Len was a superb writer who I think has never been given the praise he has deserved. His novel, his various radio plays, some of his films, and so on, have all been catalytic, all highly original. And Peterson, again, was highly regarded throughout the English-speaking world. But Peterson was perhaps more politically minded than Lister. Peterson was a scrappy guy. He'd been a wrestler and a boxer in his youth, fighting for the underdog all the way. Today he would have been called left-wing, and he was no Marxist. He was not that kind of political theoretician, but he was simply very scrappy with lots of chips on his shoulders about the poor and the underdogs and how they were being treated by society. And of course you'll remember that in the 30s we had just come through the Depression, when this was a very, very important point of view. But they were a remarkable group, and Andrew not so much gave them their head as encouraged them to come up with ideas for scripts, which he would then cull. And he'd then talk to them about what he thought should be done, and the writers would go away and finish it. And the end result was something that was highly original in any terms anywhere in the world. I think Agostini's music added a great deal to it too. Sound coming through all right?
Oh yeah, no problem. In 5, 4, 3.
Talk about writing just a little bit more. It was curious about the Dominion Drama Festival, which was obviously a big thing in Canada for many years, but you talk about it used to bribe Canadians to write their own plays. What was that all about?
To bribe them?
Yeah. Now that was a line, maybe not out of your book, but it was out of my research. You didn't hear about that, I guess. It said Dominion Drama Festival. I guess they were so desperate for Canadian writers or
No, they weren't really. They were not that much interested in Canadian content. The kind of plays that they most often presented by Canadians were the kind of plays that would appeal to their audiences back home, which were pretty slight domestic comedies and so on. No, I felt generally that the Dominion Drama Festivals really didn't fulfill their responsibility to encourage Canadian plays. One of the reasons was that in many cities across the country, the amateur groups were led by expatriate Englishmen and women, some of whom had had professional experience, you see. In most cities, some would be someone who had sung with D'Oyly Carte or performed small roles with Frank Benson. It was altogether a very English thing, and they delighted, therefore, in doing British hits, British farces, British light comedies, and so on, and the occasional Shakespeare in a very British accent. That really only changed after World War II. And the fact that there were a good many young Canadians coming up who performed, for instance, in the armed services and wanted to continue their career. They'd by now 3 or 4 years of professional experience as entertainers under their belt. Then there were things like the opera school at the University of Toronto, which was beginning to turn out first-rate singers. And there were some very good dancers coming along, like a girl called Millie, what was her real name, in Toronto, who went down and became the great Melissa Hayden, one of the leading lights of the American ballet. So there were movements starting all over, in music too, in film also, after the Second World War, that really transformed the whole situation. And the amateurs, in fact, carried on doing their thing and worried a lot about how they were going to judge some of the professionals who were using the amateur performances to get themselves seen. In other words, if a young professional actor didn't happen to be working between radio shows or other things, he would take on a role with one of the amateur companies to get more experience and to get seen on stage by the critics and so on. And the truly amateur groups, of course, thought this was unfair. And this, if I ever talked about bribing anything, this may be what I meant, that a situation was around in which some companies, particularly in the bigger cities like Toronto and Vancouver and so on, could afford to get professional performers in their companies, not by paying them a lot of money. If they did, it was under the table, but usually just by offering them big roles. And this made the competition very uneven. You see, it made it tough for the genuinely amateur companies.
One that actually leads into a thought I was going to get into later, but you were mentioning over like a 3-year period. I just wonder what it was like in those 3 years when you say that, the Stratford started and the National Ballet started and
the Canadian Opera
Theatre
Company.
and Mon started.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
It must have been, did you sense it then, or was it just like, did you feel that this was a very special time?
Oh yes. Oh, there was absolutely no question about it. There was the whole of the Canadian arts establishment was suddenly on a roll. The thing which brought it to a head, of course, was the Massey Commission and the Massey Report, which went to work in 1949 with a mandate to study the encouragement of the arts, letters, and sciences in Canada. And there have been some books recently suggesting that it was a sort of rigged affair, trying to bring elitist ideas across the country, and that's a complete misreading of what happened. A great deal of the energy and the ideas came from the grassroots. There was a tremendous amount of interest in education. In union circles, the Workers' Educational Association was a very, very big thing, and they were getting interested in arts. The company that brought big plays and productions into Sudbury was the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers Union, a communist union. The whole adult education movement arose in Saskatchewan first and then traveled east. Now this was based upon what had happened at the end of the Second World War with the forming of the United Nations, and which begins its charter by saying war begins in the minds of men, and the subsequent founding of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which set out really to meet the then tremendous demand in the world for learning about each other. Here all these countries had come together to form the United Nations, didn't know each other, didn't know enough about each other's arts and letters and science and everything else. So there was a great upsurge of what was then called self-improvement, something which the same expression isn't used today. There are similar sorts of fads going on today. But in those days, the whole self-improvement thing had grabbed people from the lowest establishment to the top. And the whole idea of cultivating oneself, same word as culture, of having a culture, same kind of cultivation as the farmer understands. He talks about growing vegetables. The artists talk about growing people. But it's all really a matter of cultivating and improving and all the rest of it. And this was a tremendous movement. Now, when the Massey Commission gave an official seal of approval to that, you see, the report came out in 1951, then, bingo, you saw it happening. The companies were formed, the theater companies, the dance companies, not only ballet companies, but modern dance as well, orchestras, and film work. And when the Canada Council, which was another recommendation of the Massey Report, finally was instituted in 1957, there was the clincher that allowed all these new institutions to be maintained. Without that, they might have just happened and then sunk. But then the next thing that changed the picture and helped enormously in keeping those booming times rolling was the coming of television. And you see, that all happened. The Massey Report came in 1951. You had at that time only one permanent ballet company in Canada, the Royal Winnipeg, which had started in 1939. It was the only one in the country. You had only 3 symphony orchestras: Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, which was very much junior to the other 2 at the time. There were no more than 5 or 6 professional theater companies in the whole land, in both languages. So the time was ripe for this kind of explosion. And as soon as that happened in '51, they all went into high gear. But at the same time, Stratford started rolling quite accidentally, with Tyrone Guthrie coming over. And Guthrie first arrived while we were preparing for television here. I was chief producer for television in Toronto, which was the first of the English language Canadian stations. And one of my jobs was to take Guthrie around to the studios, introduce him to the designers and the set painters and these people, and to let him hear records and see tape of particular artists and that kind of thing. So that the whole thing knitted very neatly together. And then, while Stratford was in the summer, at that time, since this was live television, not filmed, the same actors, technicians, lighting people, musicians and so on, could come and work in television in the winter. And for the first time, these Canadian artists and technicians had a livelihood. They could devote all their time to their art. Up until that time, it had been very difficult indeed. Possible, but difficult.
Yeah, and I guess the New Play Society was a foundation for a lot of the, it's like where a lot of the young
An
actors
enormous number of them came out of it. Yeah, over half the Stratford company in that first year were people who had worked with the New Play Society.
Part of the New Play Society, what evolved out of that was Spring Thaw, which you were heavily involved with and went on for years. And maybe talk a little bit about that, and also when you do talk about it, you mentioned it being loosely modeled on Gretchen Jelena's production of
Fridolino, yeah.
How did first of all, was that a conscious thing, or did you a real sense of what was going on in Quebec?
Oh yeah, I had for some time an idea that Canada lacked enough laughter in itself. And during the war in London, I had seen a lot of really excellent revues on the stage, things like Sweeter and Lower with Hermione Giggold, and others with Nelson Keys, and great English comics. And I had thought this idea of wedding low humor with extremely sophisticated treatment was a marvelous idea. And then when I came back to Canada after the war, my first job was at the international service of the CBC in Montreal, and there I was in the midst of Montreal civilization. I knew some French, learned more as quickly as I could, but there was not a great deal of vital theater going on in Montreal, except this one crazy series of revues. Now, Jelena had started, like me and so many others, in radio. He developed his character Fridolin, who was just a street kid, an urchin, dressed in Canadien sweater and braces, and the rest of it was mostly holes in his pants and sneakers, and a crazy cap drawn over his head. And this lippy kid just tore Quebec society apart on the stage. But he decided to develop it into a much bigger show, and he had a huge review. The designs were by the great painter Alfred Pellan, and it was brilliantly designed, choreographed, all the right things. And I saw there the Canadian equivalent, what might be done with that kind of British high style, but earthy comedy. A third element was the revues, a couple of which I'd seen at the Arts and Letters Club in the 1920s, which were very much based upon the British revues. They were amateur, but there were some clever things in them and some good material. And particularly there had developed one of the most skillful of our comedians, Jane Mallet, who had been a professional actress in Toronto in the 20s, but when that professional theatre collapsed, she'd gone on in the 30s to stay doing work with amateurs, and had developed into a brilliant comedian. And so there were these various elements, the last one of which was the kids who would come back from the Army show, the Navy show, and the Air Force show. And again, great comedians among them. And others very necessary, like Alan and Blanche Lund, the dancers. And Lund had a superb sense of humor as a choreographer. So all these people coming together provided the kind of necessary friction out of which it was possible to do a Canadian review. But when it happened, as you remember from the book, it was entirely accidental. We had been planning a production of Two Solitudes, an adaptation of Hugh MacLennan's novel, which was not ready in time, and we had to get a review ready in 2 weeks. So we took them from all these sources. Anybody who had a bit of material, we stood them up and got them read. We wrote more stuff. We snitched stuff from radio. Tommy Tweed had a great song from one of his radio shows about union problems called "It'll Never Get Well If You Pick It." And Lister Sinclair had written a song called "We All Hate Toronto," which Agostini had written music to. And all of these things simply came together. We threw it together. It had no business being the success that it was, but it hit a chord. It hit a chord with Canadian audiences. The laughter was hysterical, and it was because they were laughing at their own subjects. It wasn't English, it wasn't American, it was them. It was them up there on the stage. And that is what Gélina had succeeded in doing in Montreal, and I felt had to be done in Toronto.
What else do you think, and who else do you think contributed significantly from French-Canadian theatre, both in Quebec and also, I guess there was Jean Gaston?
Well, once the new Play Society decided to bring in Quebec companies for the first time, the first one, though it wasn't supposed to have been the first one, the first invited was a group called L'Équipe, who were going to perform Huis Clos, the remarkable play called No Exit in English, which was very hot in the international market at the time, but they were going to do it in French. And they were unable to come at the last minute, so we invited the basic company from which that had sprung. Now, this was an amateur company of a kind, but a very rare kind. It had been started within the church by Father Émile Legault to do the great classics, Molière mainly. And he had a remarkable young company, again, young students mainly, but he was looking after them, you know, in the way that the church can. He was seeing that they got fed and they had enough money to get along with. This group had won the top award at the at the Dominion Drama Festival, and they were prepared to come in and do a Molière. Now, in that same company were Jean Gaston, Jean-Louis Roux, who has just been made a senator, the first senator that I know of from the arts in Canada, and a remarkable group of French actors, most of whom then formed their own company in the early 1950s, calling itself Le Théâtre du Nouveau Monde, the Theatre of the New World. And it was from them that great designers particularly arose, and they were all invited down to Stratford to take part in a Henry V there, playing the French court. Gélina was there, and Gaston, and Roux, and Guy Hoffmann, and the rest of them. And so they began to feel at home at Stratford. They were invited back again. They were doing Shakespeare in Montreal now as well as Molière. And their influence was most, I think, in the stylishness of the productions, which matched what Guthrie was trying to do at Stratford. There was an elegance to them, a polish that was difficult for quite a few Canadian actors, because Canadian actors by that time were already being hornswoggled by the method actors of New York and trying to act natural instead of the high style that the classics demand. And so that is a very valuable input from the province of Quebec. They also developed some first-class directors, and after Gélinas, some very fine writers, finally producing Tremblay. But it was Gélinas who started also writing more or less in the joual of Montreal, Montreal's own French language. Tremblay later made much more of it in his plays. But that was the beginning of a huge and very successful movement in French theatre. And it wasn't confined to those companies. Le Théâtre du Rideau Vert was another one which was doing fine professional companies. And then there were all sorts, half a dozen other professional companies started up at the same time, same period.
I'd like to go into a little bit of the television now, and starting with, I guess, your decision to come back to Canada and start with the CBC, especially since you had such a wonderful offer from the States. And maybe you could tell a little bit about your conversation you had with Stuart Griffiths, or that whole little vignette.
Yeah. Well, it was a very, very difficult decision. They had offered me, CBC had offered me the job of program director for television. This was, of course, long before it was on the air. The principal job of the program director was to organize the training. We were going to be in training for 2 years before we hit the air. And I had done some television at the United Nations in New York, which is why I was offered the job, I think. And then after having offered it to me, they reneged 2 weeks later while I was still considering it. I didn't say yes right away. I wanted to think about it. They reneged because the board of the CBC had decided that it had to be an internal appointment. Even though I had worked for the CBC previously in several capacities. In Toronto, I'd been a features producer, the youngest on staff. I'd been at the International Service. I'd been chief producer of CBC Radio in Vancouver. But I was not at that time on staff, and they wanted an internal candidate. So I said, to hell with you. And I had to go down to New York the following day anyway, to drive down to do some productions at the United Nations. And I simply made up my mind, and my wife joined me in making up our mind, that we would just leave the country. That I was fed up with Canada. And I went down to New York and had only been there a few weeks when I received an invitation from the producer of Studio One on CBS, which was then the biggest of the American television dramas, offering me a job as one of the 3 directors of the program. And while I was still considering this, I got myself an agent, which is what you have to do in New York. While I was still considering this, I got a telephone call from Stuart Griffiths, who had been a close colleague and great friend of mine at the International Service, saying that he had been appointed to this job of program director, but that he had told him he wouldn't take it unless I would come and do it with him, because he said he didn't know enough about television, and he would give me the job of chief producer. That's to say, I would be in charge of all production, while he looked after the administrative and programming details. And I said to him simply that there was no way I was being offered, at the moment, $500 to work in New York, and he was offering me $165 to come back to Toronto. And then before I turned around, my agent phoned me to say that she'd got it raised to $750. And I then told her, I said, okay, go ahead and sign. I'll take whatever they offer. But I didn't understand American ways. She had got back to them and told them that I was being wooed by another network, in quotes. And so it went up to 1,000. And then as it appeared that Canada was winning out, because it all seemed to me rather ridiculous, this amount of money, I began to think I was prostituting myself, you see. And the idea of having a whole network to play with in Canada, and a clean slate. You know, to start from scratch, to build your own kind of television, began to be very appealing. Anyway, the final offer I got from CBS was $1,500 a week, and I signed with the CBC for $165, and Griffiths pointed out that the difference in the pay reflected roughly the difference in population between the two countries. So that brought me back to Canada. And most days I don't regret it. It's been a marvelous adventure since. But one often wonders about those junctures in life. What if, you know? And in subsequent years, I found myself back at the United Nations doing television and films there. Had a second opportunity to stay there, and didn't want to do it because I felt I couldn't spend the rest of my life doing propaganda, even for so lofty an organization as the UN.